hand slammed down on a dining table so hard the silverware jumped. A young woman flinched back in her chair. The man standing over her was red-faced, pointing, his voice low and ugly, somehow worse than shouting. She kept her eyes down while he said the words again, slow, like she needed them repeated to understand. She understood. She had understood her whole life. The room went still. Not a sound. Nobody moved. The man said one more thing, turned, and walked out. Her name was Eleanor, and her father had just made a decision about her body and her future that she had no say in. Somewhere across the fields, a man named Silas was being pulled from his work. He had no idea why. What would happen between them over the coming months? Nobody in that house could have predicted it. Stay with me on this one. Now, to understand what this story is really about, you need to understand the world it happened in. This is the American South. The 1840s. Plantation country. The kind of place where a man's worth was measured by how much land he owned and how many people he owned along with it. Thomas Hargrove owned a lot of both. He was not a man given to doubt. He had built his plantation from a smaller inheritance, expanded it, worked it hard, and considered himself a practical man. He didn't think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as efficient. That's how men like him operated. They turned everything, the land, the weather, other human beings, into a ledger. What costs? What pays? What is worth keeping? Eleanor was his only child. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 7, and Thomas had raised her the way a man like him raises anything, with expectations and without much tenderness. She was smart. She had read almost everything in his library twice. She could discuss politics and agriculture and history with more precision than most men he knew. But Thomas Hargrove did not think about his daughter in terms of her mind. He thought about her in terms of who would marry her. And that was the problem. Eleanor was 22 years old. She was large, not just heavy, but truly large, the kind of size that made people in that era look away quickly and then look back. She had been that way most of her life. She ate when she was sad, and she was sad more often than she let on. She moved carefully, deliberately, as if she was always aware of how much space she took up. She had taught herself to do that, to take up less, to apologize for existing just a little bit with every step. Thomas had tried everything he could think of. He had hired a physician who prescribed powders and pills that made Eleanor ill. He had brought in a governess who supervised her meals and reported back to him every evening, which lasted 3 months before Eleanor stopped eating in front of the woman entirely. He had written to men he knew in Charleston and Savannah, men with sons of a certain age, and mentioned Eleanor without mentioning her weight. And those conversations had always gone quiet once they eventually saw her. He was humiliated, genuinely, deeply humiliated. In a world where a man's daughter was a reflection of his household, Eleanor felt to him like a door left hanging off its hinges. Believe me when I tell you, he never once thought about what she felt. Silas had been on the Hargrove plantation for 11 years. He had arrived from a sail down the river, and he had come with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and a knowledge that nobody had thought to take from him. He knew plants. He knew which roots would bring a fever down and which would bring one on. He knew what bark to brew for a deep cough, what to press against a wound to keep infection out. He had learned it from his mother, who had learned it from her mother, all the way back to a place none of them had ever seen. The enslaved community on that plantation knew about Silas and used his knowledge quietly. The overseer knew and tolerated it because it kept workers healthy and working. Thomas Hargrove had heard about it in a passing, dismissive way, the way men like him heard about things that happened in the quarters. Something about the man who knows herbs. Now, standing in the hallway outside the dining room after his daughter had refused to come to Sunday dinner, Thomas was thinking about that man for the first time seriously. Eleanor had sat alone in her room. One of the house servants had told Thomas she'd been crying. He didn't know what to do with a crying daughter, but he knew what to do with a problem. He called for Silas. His instructions were direct. He wanted the man to put Eleanor on some kind of regimen. Roots, vegetables, physical activity, whatever was in his knowledge. He was to meet with Eleanor daily. He was to monitor what she ate. He was to, in Thomas Hargrove's exact words, fix the situation. Silas listened to every word. He kept his face still and his eyes down and did not say a single thing that was not required. That was the only safe way to survive a conversation like that one. But on his walk back toward the quarters, he was already thinking. Not about how to follow the order, he would do that part. He didn't have a choice about that part. He was thinking about Eleanor. He had seen her once from a distance, walking the garden alone. He didn't know anything about her except that she moved like someone carrying a weight that went well beyond what anyone could see. He knew something about that. The first meeting was in the kitchen garden, early morning. Thomas had arranged it without consulting Eleanor. He had simply sent word through a house servant the night before. She was to be in the kitchen garden at 6 in the morning. That was it. No explanation. Eleanor hadn't slept. She had sat at her window in the dark, trying to understand what new humiliation was coming. When she came outside and found Silas waiting, a man she had never spoken to, standing quietly among the herb rows, she stopped. He didn't look at her the way she was used to being looked at. Not the quick appraisal and then the look away. Not the flicker of discomfort. He looked at her the way you look at someone you are about to have a real conversation with. Steady. Direct. Nothing practiced in it. He said good morning. She said good morning back. And then there was a silence where neither of them knew quite how to begin. They both understood the situation. Both understood what Thomas Hargrove expected. But neither one of them wanted to say it out loud first. Silas spoke. He said he knew plants and herbs. He said he had been asked to help with her health. He said this carefully, without any weight on the word help, without any hint of judgment. Then he asked if she would like to see what was growing in this garden before they talked about anything else. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she said yes. They walked the rows. He pointed to things. Told her their names, the common names, and sometimes the other names, the ones his mother had used. He told her what each plant did. He talked to her the way you talk to a person who is capable of understanding. Not simplified, not cautious. Just information offered with respect. Nobody had talked to Eleanor that way in a long time. She started asking questions. Real ones. Why did this particular herb grow better in shade? What happened when you combined this root with that one? She had read enough in her father's library to know some of what he was describing, and she said so. He told her, without missing a beat, that reading about plants and knowing plants were two different things, but that reading was a fine start. She almost smiled. That was the first morning. The meetings continued. Every day at 6 they were in the garden. Thomas Hargrove got his daily reports. Silas told him what Eleanor had eaten, what movements they had done, how long they had walked. He reported it plainly and without detail, and Thomas nodded and moved on. He was satisfied something was being done. He didn't ask for more. But here is what was actually happening. Silas wasn't running a regimen. He was having conversations. He talked to Eleanor about food the way his mother had talked about it. Not as something to restrict, not as a source of shame, but as something living. Every plant had a history. Every meal had a logic. He showed her how to prepare things simply, how to eat slowly, how to pay attention to what her body was actually telling her. Not what her father told her it was saying, but what she herself could feel. And she talked back. She told him things she hadn't said to anyone. She told him she ate at night when the house was quiet because it was the only time she felt like no one was watching. She told him she had long ago stopped thinking of her body as something that belonged to her. It had always been something to be assessed, corrected, discussed at other people's tables. She said this like a person stating a plain fact, not asking for sympathy. Silas listened. He didn't rush to fix it. He didn't tell her she was wrong to feel that way. He let the words sit. Then he said something that stopped her entirely. He said that in his people's culture, the one he carried in his memory even though it had been taken from him in every physical sense, a person's body was not a problem to be solved. It was the thing you lived in, the thing that moved you through the world. It deserved to be fed well and moved well and spoken to with respect. Not punished, not managed, not apologized for. Eleanor sat with that for a long time. Weeks passed. She started sleeping better. She started looking forward to the mornings in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything in years. She was eating differently, not less, not in the punishing way her father had always intended, but with more attention. More intention. She began to notice small things about herself that she hadn't noticed before. She wasn't shrinking, but she was taking up space differently, more deliberately, like someone who had decided they were allowed to be there. Thomas Hargrove noticed something had changed. He couldn't name it exactly. She seemed calmer, less closed off. She came to dinner without being summoned. She sat at the table and ate without the furtive, guilty quality she had always brought to meals before. He took this as confirmation that the regimen was working. He told himself he had handled the situation correctly. One evening at the end of the second month, he saw Eleanor walking in the garden at dusk. She was alone, moving at a good steady pace, not shuffling, not apologizing for herself with every step. She had a small, private smile on her face that he hadn't seen since she was a child. He went to bed that night satisfied. Neither of them knew that Thomas Hargrove was about to discover what had really been passing between his daughter and the man he had sent to fix her. And for a brief moment, right then, that evening, everything felt quiet, settled, safe. That quiet lasted 3 days. On the fourth day, Thomas came home early from a meeting in town. He expected to find Eleanor in her room or the parlor. Instead, she wasn't in the house at all. One of the servants told him she was in the kitchen garden. He walked out there himself. He heard them before he saw them. Eleanor's voice, easy and unhurried, asking something about a plant. Then Silas's voice answering. And then Eleanor laughing. A real laugh. Not a polite one. The kind that comes from somewhere deep. Thomas Hargrove stood at the edge of the garden and watched. They were sitting on an overturned crate and a wooden stool, facing each other, close enough for a genuine conversation. Silas was holding up a bundle of dried herbs, explaining something. His face, and this was what stopped Thomas cold, his face was animated. Easy. Not careful. Not performing deference. He was just talking to her, like a man talking to another person. And Eleanor was looking at him like he was the most interesting person she had ever met in her life. Thomas walked away without saying a word. But something had shifted in him. Something ugly and specific. It wasn't concern for Eleanor's well-being. It was the feeling of a man who had given an order and discovered the order had been misunderstood, or worse, ignored in favor of something he hadn't authorized. He did not like what he had seen. That night he called the overseer in. A man named Briggs, who had run this plantation's daily operations for 12 years. Thomas told him to begin watching the garden meetings. Not what was being eaten or how far they were walking. He wanted to know what was being said. Briggs did as he was told. 3 days later he reported back. The conversations covered a great many subjects, he said. The plants, yes, but also history. Silas apparently had knowledge of his African heritage and had been sharing it with Miss Eleanor. He had talked about crops in West Africa, about medicine, about how food and the body were understood before the trade routes changed everything. He had talked about what had been lost. Thomas listened to all of it. Then he asked one question. He asked if there was anything improper happening. Briggs said no. Nothing of that nature. Thomas said nothing. He stood at the window for a long time. Now here's the thing. What he had originally feared was a transgression of a particular kind, and Briggs had told him there was none. That should have been the end of it. But Thomas Hargrove understood power in his bones. And what Briggs had just described. An enslaved man sharing his heritage and knowledge with the planter's daughter, the two of them sitting together talking as equals, Eleanor listening with a kind of attention she had never given her own father. That was a different kind of threat. Quieter one. Harder to point to, but real. He couldn't name it precisely, but he felt it like a loose floorboard under his foot. He gave Briggs a new instruction. The garden meetings were finished. Silas had served his purpose. Eleanor would take her meals in the dining room from now on under his eye. Then he went to Eleanor's room. She was reading by the window when he knocked. He told her the arrangement with Silas was finished. He told her she looked better, and she did. He said this like it was a compliment. He said it was time to return to a normal household routine. Eleanor looked at him. Then she asked why. Thomas had not expected that question. Eleanor had never asked him why. He said it wasn't necessary to continue. She said she had found it helpful. He said he was glad. She said, "Then why stop it?" He said because he said so and that was sufficient. She kept looking at him, and this was new, something neither of them had seen coming, without looking away. She said, "He has done nothing wrong." Thomas said, "I haven't said he has." She said, "Then what is it?" Thomas Hargrove had no answer that didn't expose him, and that made him angry in a specific, unsettled way. He told her the decision was made, and walked out. That was when Eleanor understood something. Not just about her father. About the entire structure of the world she had grown up in and never truly looked at directly. Silas had been summoned to correct her body, not to help her. He had been used as a tool, and the moment it became clear that two human beings had formed a genuine connection across the line her father had built his life around, her father was threatened. Not because something had gone wrong, because something had gone right. She sat at her window for a long time after he left. Then she did something she had never done before in 22 years. She made a decision that had nothing to do with what Thomas Hargrove wanted. She got up, found the house servant who carried messages, and sent word to Silas. "If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. I'll be right here when you get back." She told him, "Be careful." Her father was watching, and he needed to know what was coming. Silas received Eleanor's warning before sunrise. He had slept poorly. He already knew something had changed. He had seen Briggs watching the garden from the fence line 2 days running. He had changed nothing about his manner, said nothing different from what was always said, but he had felt the shift in the air the way you feel weather before the sky changes. Low and heavy. That stillness before something breaks open. Eleanor's message told him what he had already suspected, but it also told him something he hadn't expected. She had sent it. At real risk to herself, she had sent it. That meant something. He sat with that for a while. In the days that followed, he was careful. He showed up to his regular field work. He kept his head down. He spoke only when spoken to. He was, to all outward appearances, exactly what Thomas Hargrove had always expected him to be. Contained. Compliant. Present only where he was supposed to be. But Eleanor was not standing still. She began moving through the house differently. She had spent her whole life trying to be invisible. Drifting to the edges of rooms, answering questions with as few words as possible, taking up as little space as she could manage. She recognized that instinct now for what it was. She had learned it from necessity, the way Silas had learned stillness and compliance from necessity. Different circumstances. Not the same situation by any measure, but the same mechanism underneath. She started paying attention to things she had never let herself look at directly before. She watched how Briggs spoke to the people in the fields. She watched how a woman named Clara, who had worked in the Hargrove kitchen for 12 years, flinched every time Thomas entered a room. She watched how a young man, named James, moved through the yard, always near the edges, always aware of the exits. She had lived in this house for 22 years and had never seen any of it clearly, because she had been too focused on disappearing herself to look outward at anyone else. She started small. She began stopping in the kitchen to talk to Clara. Not about anything critical, just talking. Learning names, families, how long people had been there, where they had come from before. She made it look casual. She was careful about it. It was not casual. And then her father made a move she had not anticipated. He announced that Silas would be sold. He said it at breakfast, without preamble, the way he announced any business matter. He had been approached by a buyer for some of the property, he said. He was consolidating. Several workers would be let go, and Silas among them. Eleanor set down her fork. She asked when. He said within the month. She said nothing else. She finished her breakfast. She excused herself from the table in a normal voice. And then she went to find Briggs. What happened in that conversation would have shocked Thomas Hargrove badly if he had known about it. Eleanor walked up to the man her father used to keep order over every person on that property. The overseer, a man with authority over everyone except the Hargroves themselves, and she looked him straight in the eye. She said she knew things about how Briggs ran this plantation that her father did not know. She had seen things over the years, heard things, and kept quiet because keeping quiet had always seemed like survival. She was done keeping quiet. She said that if Silas was sold, she would tell her father everything she knew. Every single thing. Briggs stared at her. She didn't look away. He asked if she understood what she was doing. She said she was starting to understand it for the first time. He walked away without answering. But that afternoon he went to Thomas Hargrove and told him there had been a complication with the sale. Some problem with the paperwork, the buyer's credit. He improvised well. He had kept his position 12 years through adaptability. He told Thomas it would be better to hold off on Silas for now. Thomas accepted this. He had other things on his mind. Silas was not sold that month. When Eleanor found a way to tell Silas what she had done, quietly through Clara, a note that said almost nothing but meant everything, he read it twice. He sat down on the edge of his bed. He thought about the woman he had first met in the garden. The one who couldn't quite look up, who apologized for herself with every step she took. He didn't have a word for what she had become in the months since then, but he had a feeling for it. The same feeling he had when a plant he hadn't expected to survive pushed up through hard, dry ground. He folded the note carefully and kept it. Thomas Hargrove found out the truth 3 weeks later. It was Clara who told him. Not because she wanted to, and this is the part that's hardest to explain simply. Briggs had found out about the note. He had used it as leverage over Clara, threatening to put the blame for the whole business on her if it came to light. Clara, faced with the choice between her own safety and Eleanor's secret, made the only choice that made sense for a woman in her position. She told Thomas what Eleanor had done. He called Eleanor into his study that same evening. She came in and sat down across from him without being told to sit. She folded her hands in her lap. She did not look frightened, and that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle him. He laid out what he knew. Eleanor had threatened his overseer. She had gathered information in this house and used it against his interests. She had directly interfered with the sale of plantation property. And she had done all of it on behalf of— He paused here, choosing his word. An enslaved man. Eleanor let him finish. Then she said, yes, all of that was true. Thomas looked at her for a long time. He was not a man who expected to be surprised by his own daughter, and she had surprised him badly. He told her she didn't understand what she had done. She had put herself at risk. She had put the household at risk. For someone who— He stopped himself. Eleanor said, for someone who what? He said, you know what I mean. She said she did know, and she wanted him to say it out loud. She waited. He didn't say it. She said, he taught me things that no one else in my life ever thought to teach me. He talked to me like I was worth talking to. He never once looked at me the way you have looked at me my whole life. And I don't know how to explain to you what that meant. But it meant enough that I am sitting here telling you the truth about all of it rather than lying. The room went quiet. Thomas stood up and walked to the window. He stood there a long time with his back to her. When he turned around, his face had something in it that Eleanor had almost never seen. Not softness. Something closer to confusion. The confusion of a man encountering something he had no category for. He said, what do you want from me, Eleanor? She said, I want Silas to stay, and I want you to leave him alone. He asked why he should. She said, because he did what you asked him to do. He helped me. And because if you sell him or punish him for what I did, you'll know for the rest of your life that you punished a man for treating your daughter with decency. And I think even you can't quite live with that. She didn't know if that was true. She wasn't certain Thomas Hargrove was capable of being reached that way. But it was the only honest thing left to say, and she said it. He told her to go to her room. She went. Silas was not sold. He was not punished. Thomas Hargrove did not speak directly to either of them about any of it again. He was a man who preferred to act as though a problem had been managed rather than acknowledge that he hadn't managed it at all. He put the whole business into a locked room in his mind and moved forward. But things were different after that. Eleanor moved through the house with a steadiness she hadn't had before. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize for her presence. She helped where she could, quietly, carefully, in the small ways that don't announce themselves. A word to a house servant about what was being discussed in the parlor. A warning passed through Clara, who had not been punished, who remained in the kitchen. Small things. The kind of small things that, in the world they were living in, were the only kind available to her. Silas worked the field. He kept his head down. He kept his knowledge close, shared it only with the people who came to him in the evenings when the day was done, needing something for a wound or a fever or a grief that had no other remedy. He gave what he could. He was careful. He survived. On one afternoon in the late fall, Eleanor was in the kitchen garden alone. She had started doing this on her own, tending the herb rows, pulling weeds, checking which plants had gone to seed. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, and it was Silas, passing through on his way to the tool shed. They looked at each other. He nodded. She nodded. And that was all. That was the whole thing. Two people who had done something real for each other, in a world that had not wanted them to, passing each other on an ordinary afternoon with nothing to show for it but what they carried inside. Here is what I want to leave you with. Eleanor didn't save Silas. She delayed one sale in 1 month, in a world built to make that kind of gesture temporary and incomplete. She knew that. She didn't pretend otherwise. What she did was smaller and more honest than a rescue. She stood up, for the first time in her life, for someone other than herself. And she did it because a man she had been expected to look past had looked directly at her, and seen someone worth seeing. That is the part that changes a person. Not the grand gesture. Not the dramatic moment. The moment when someone treats you like you matter and you decide quietly, privately, with no audience, that you are going to treat someone else the same way. That you are going to carry that forward instead of letting it stop with you. Eleanor carried it for the rest of her life. So did Silas. And here is one more thing worth saying now that the story is done. Thomas Hargrove had sent Silas to fix his daughter. He had meant it as a correction, maybe even as a small humiliation. A practical solution to a problem that embarrassed him. He never once considered that what he was actually doing was putting two people in the same garden and giving them time. Time to talk. Time to see each other. Time to decide, each in their own way, what kind of person they were going to be. He had given them that without meaning to, and it turned out to be the most valuable thing anyone had ever given either of them. He never understood that part. Some people don't. They set things in motion and never see what they actually started. But we've seen it, and that's enough.